A white police officer spits on a black man, not knowing he is the new chief of police. Welcome back to Meaningful Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and start the story right now. On a suffocating August morning, the air thick with humidity and secrets, Richard Nelson stepped out of his beat-up sedan in the shadow of Blue Ridge. A forgotten speck of a city nestled in the rolling, mist-cloaked hills of North Carolina. The sun beat down mercilessly, glinting off the cracked asphalt, but Richard's sharp eyes were hidden beneath the brim of a battered baseball cap. Dressed in a faded plaid shirt that clung to his broad shoulders, jeans worn thin at the knees, and scuffed sneakers that crunched against the gravel, he looked like a man the world had chewed up and spat out. But that was the point. This was no ordinary arrival, no grand entrance with sirens or polished badges. Richard Nelson, the newly minted police chief, was a predator in disguise, stalking into the heart of his prey, a precinct rotting from the inside. 2 decades in law enforcement had carved him into a force of nature, grit and steel forged through years of climbing a ladder slick with blood and betrayal. Yet here he was, deliberately shedding the trappings of power, his badge tucked away, his authority veiled. Why? Because Richard didn't trust the whispers that had reached him, rumors of corruption, prejudice, and a department festering like an open wound. As a black man stepping into a role that could make or break this town, he refused to sip from the sanitized cup of staged introductions or rehearsed smiles. He craved the raw, unfiltered truth, the kind that only revealed itself when the masks were off and the lights were low. The precinct loomed ahead, a squat, gray beast of a building, its parking lot a hive of restless energy. Officers milled about, their laughter cutting through the muggy air like jagged glass, their eyes flicking toward him with lazy curiosity before dismissing him as nothing. Perfect. His appointment had been a quiet murmur, announced just days ago, and he'd made damn sure no fanfare followed. No one knew his face, not yet. Adjusting his cap, he squared his shoulders, the weight of his mission pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. This wasn't just a job, it was a reckoning. He'd faced resistance before, stared it down and crushed it, but Blue Ridge was a beast of its own. And Richard could feel it in his bones. This place would test him, bend him, maybe even break him. As he took his first step toward the side entrance, the faint echo of mocking laughter trailed behind him, a siren call to the chaos he was about to unleash. Richard slipped through the precinct's side entrance like a ghost, the heavy door groaning shut behind him as he stepped into a world buzzing with raw, untamed life. The air inside was a stale cocktail of burnt coffee and sweat, the tiled floors gleaming under the harsh flicker of fluorescent lights that buzzed like a swarm of angry hornets. He moved deliberately, his scuffed sneakers silent against the ground, his eyes darting beneath the shadow of his cap, taking in every detail, every fracture in the facade. Clusters of officers lounged near desks, their voices a chaotic symphony of boasts and barks, paperwork rustling like dry leaves in their hands. To them, he was invisible, a nobody drifting through their kingdom of chaos. That is, until he lingered too long near the break room. Hey, you! The voice sliced through the din like a blade, sharp and venomous. Richard turned, slow and deliberate, to face the predator stalking toward him, Officer Daniels, a wiry white cop with a smirk smeared across his face like a fresh wound. His badge glinted under the lights, a twisted crown for a petty tyrant. And behind him, a pack of onlookers leaned against the wall, their eyes gleaming with hungry anticipation. Richard parted his lips to speak, but Daniels pounced first, his words dripping with acid. Lost, are we? This ain't no damn shelter, pal. His tone was a taunt, a dare, his chest puffed out for the audience he knew was watching. Take that mess somewhere else. The air thickened, crackling with menace. Richard stood rooted, the insult slamming into him like a fist. But his face remained a mask of stone. Should he rip the veil off now? Reveal the fire beneath? Or let this venomous dance play out? Before he could choose, Daniels closed the gap, his voice rising to a snarl that echoed off the walls. Didn't you hear me? Get out. We don't need your kind stinking up the place. Laughter erupted, a jagged, cruel chorus from the pack, each guffaw a spark igniting the tinder of Richard's restraint. His jaw tightened, his pulse hammering like war drums in his ears. But he held his ground. A silent storm brewing, Then, without warning, Daniels lunged forward, his face inches from Richard's, and spat, a wet, warm gob of contempt that struck Richard's cheek and dripped down like slow poison. Time fractured. The room exploded into chaos, laughter roaring louder. One officer slamming a fist on the table in glee. Another hissing through a grin. Show the riffraff where they belong. Richard's breath caught, the saliva a searing brand against his skin. His mind a whirlwind of rage and calculation. Yet his hands moved with eerie calm, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket, wiping the filth away with deliberate strokes. The pack jeered on, oblivious to the predator they'd just awakened. Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors? His voice cut through the noise, low and steady, a blade wrapped in silk. Daniels smirked, leaning back as if he'd won some twisted game. Only the ones who don't belong. He sneered, and the laughter flared again, a wildfire feeding on ignorance. Richard said nothing, his gaze locking onto Daniels for a heartbeat, a promise of reckoning, before he turned and strode down the hallway. The echoes of their mockery chasing him like rabid dogs. Behind him, the intercom crackled to life. A summons to the briefing room. The stage was set, and the curtain was about to rise on a scene that would shatter their world. Richard stalked away from the jeering pack, his footsteps a steady drumbeat against the tiled floor, each one a countdown to the storm about to break. The precinct's stale air clung to him like a shroud as he moved. The handkerchief still crumpled in his fist. The sting of Daniels spit a lingering ember on his skin. He didn't glance back, not yet. The intercom's sudden crackle sliced through the hum of the building. A voice barking, all personnel to the briefing room. Now, it was a summons, a clarion call, and Richard felt the weight of it settle into his bones. The moment he'd been waiting for, the unmasking, was barreling toward them all like a runaway freight train. The briefing room pulsed with life as he slipped in through a side door. A folder bearing the precinct's seal clutched in his hand like a loaded gun. Officers poured in, their voices a raucous tangle of coffee-fueled bravado and inside jokes. Their mugs clinking like the prelude to a barroom brawl. Some still snickered, their eyes glinting with the afterglow of the breakroom spectacle. Daniels among them, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his smug grin a banner of unchecked arrogance. Richard lingered just out of sight, a shadow among shadows, watching the predators strut and preen, blissfully unaware of the jaws closing around them. Captain Harris, a grizzled bear of a man with a mustache like steel wool, stepped to the front, his gravelly voice cutting through the chaos. All right, pipe down, we've got business today. The room simmered down, curiosity sharpening the air like a blade. Harris cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd. Chief Caldwell's gone, retired last month. As you know, we've been waiting for his replacement. And I'm damn proud to introduce the man taking the helm. A leader with a record that'd make you lot sit up straight if you had half a brain. A ripple of murmurs spread, head swiveling, but Daniels just smirked wider. A king on his crumbling throne. Then Richard moved. His footsteps echoed like thunderclaps in the hush. Each one deliberate, each one a hammer striking the anvil of their ignorance. He emerged from the shadows, the folder slamming onto the podium with a sound that cracked the room wide open. The air turned to ice. Eyes widened, mouths slackened, and Daniel's smirk twisted into something sickly. A dying flame snuffed out by dawning horror. Richard stood tall, his plaid shirt and worn jeans a stark contrast to the power radiating from him. His gaze sweeping the room like a searchlight exposing every hidden sin. The folder gleamed under the lights, a guillotine blade poised to fall. "Good morning," he began, his voice a low rumble, steady as granite yet laced with a quiet fury that made the walls tremble. "My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." Silence crashed down, thick and suffocating, a void where their laughter had once reigned. Daniel's face drained to a ghostly white, his arms dropping like a puppet with cut strings. Recognition clawing its way into his skull. Whispers slithered through the crowd, shock, fear, disbelief, but Richard's eyes pinned them all. Unrelenting, unyielding. "When I walked in this morning," he continued, his words carving through the tension like a scalpel, "I came in plain clothes. Not for show, but to see you, really see you, without the polish and the lies. And what I found." He paused, letting the weight settle, his gaze locking onto Daniel's for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity. What I found was a disgrace. The room quaked beneath his calm, the murmurs rising like a tide. But he raised a hand, silencing them as effortlessly as a god stilling a storm. Daniels shifted, sweat beading on his brow, his kingdom of bravado crumbling to ash. The revelation had landed, and the aftershocks were only beginning. The briefing room hung in a suffocating silence, the air crackling with the aftermath of Richard's revelation. Every officer frozen under the weight of his gaze. He stood at the podium, a titan in worn plaid, his presence a storm cloud swelling with unspoken thunder. Daniels squirmed against the wall, his once smug face now a mask of crimson shame, beads of sweat glistening like tears he'd never shed. The folder on the lectern loomed like a judge's gavel, its seal a silent promise of justice poised to strike. Richard's eyes, dark and unyielding, swept the room, pinning each soul in place as if they were moths caught in a spider's web. "I've seen enough this morning to know what festers here," he said, his voice a low growl that reverberated through the walls, each word a spark igniting the dry tinder of their guilt. Behaviors so vile, so rotten, they'd make the devil himself recoil. Unprofessional? That's too kind. What I witnessed was a betrayal of the badge, of the oath, of every soul this precinct swore to protect. A murmur dared to rise, a feeble ripple of unease. But Richard's hand shot up, slicing it dead. The room stilled again, the tension a taut wire ready to snap. He leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the podium like a specter of reckoning. "Respect isn't a choice," he declared, his tone sharpening to a blade's edge. "It's the blood in the veins of what we do. Without it, we're nothing but bullies with guns. Parasites feeding on the trust of the people we serve." His words landed like blows, each one heavier than the last, and the officers shrank beneath them, their bravado dissolving into the flickering light. Daniels twitched, his eyes darting to the floor as if it might swallow him whole. But there was no escape, not now. Richard stepped from the podium, his movements slow and predatory, the folder left behind like a loaded trap. He advanced toward the crowd, the air thickening with every step, until he stopped mere feet from Daniels. The officer flinched, a cornered animal staring into the jaws of fate. "Officer Daniels," Richard said, his voice a quiet thunderclap, each syllable dripping with controlled fury. "You're the living rot in this department. When you spat in my face, you didn't just disgrace me, you spat on the badge, the oath, the very soul of this place." Daniels stammered, his lips trembling. "Chief, I didn't know," but Richard cut him off, his words a whip crack. "That's the poison in you. You didn't know because you didn't care. You saw a man you thought was nothing. And you struck, because that's the game you play here." The room held its breath, every eye locked on the confrontation, the silence a guillotine blade hovering above them all. Richard turned, his gaze raking across the crowd like wildfire. "What I saw wasn't one man's sin, it was a sickness. A culture where cruelty is currency and prejudice is pride. That ends today." He stepped back, his voice rising, a clarion call cutting through the haze. "I've fought for justice my whole life, on the streets, in the shadows, and now in these walls. Change won't come easy, but it will come. Integrity, respect, accountability. That's the line I draw. And you'll either stand with it or fall." With a nod to Captain Harris, he delivered the final blow. Effective immediately. "Officer Daniels is suspended, pending investigation. This isn't a warning shot, it's a purge. If you can't meet this standard, pack your bags." Gasps tore through the room, a jagged chorus of shock. Daniels' face twisted, his fists clenching as rage and humiliation warred within him. But Richard stood unmoved, a colossus of resolve. "This isn't about revenge," he said, his voice steady as stone. "It's about what we must become. Step up, or step out." The room trembled under his words, the old order shattering like glass. And in that moment, every officer knew, the reckoning had begun. The briefing room emptied in a stunned exodus, the officers slinking out like scolded dogs, their usual swagger drowned in the echo of Richard's words. No laughter trailed them now, only the heavy shuffle of boots and the weight of a silence that screamed louder than their earlier jeers. Daniels stormed ahead, a tempest of fury and shame, his face a molten red, his eyes blazing with defiance as he shoved past his peers. The others averted their gazes, some swallowing guilt like bitter bile, others staring into the void. their minds reeling from the hammer that had just shattered their world. Richard lingered at the podium, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floor, a sentinel watching the old guard fracture. In his office, he sank into the creaking chair behind a desk buried under a mountain of files. The air thick with the scent of dust and stale resolve. He exhaled, a slow, deep release, and the phone's shrill ring jolted the stillness like a gunshot. Captain Harris's voice crackled through, tentative but edged with awe. "Chief, that was, hell, you shook 'em good today. In a way they won't forget." Richard's lips twitched, a flicker of grim satisfaction. "Thanks, Captain, but the real fight's just starting. I want Daniel's history, every complaint, every dirty mark, on my desk by dawn." Harris hesitated, then agreed. "You got it, Chief," before adding, "You've lit a fire under him. Some might even burn clean." The line went dead, and Richard leaned back, the weight of his mission sinking deeper into his bones. The weeks that followed were a battlefield of whispers and shifting loyalties. The precinct morphed into a cauldron of unease. Officers who once reveled in Daniel's antics now skulked past him, their eyes averted as if he were a plague-ridden outcast. Word of his suspension spread like wildfire, each hushed conversation a spark fueling the blaze of change. Richard prowled the halls daily, his presence a relentless tide, greeting every soul with a nod that carried the promise of scrutiny. Some rose to meet it. Officer Reyes, a wiry young recruit with haunted eyes, cornered him one afternoon, her voice trembling but resolute. "Chief, I've been part of it, the silence, the fear. I want to be better." Richard's gaze softened, but his tone was iron. "That's all I ask, Reyes. It starts with you." She nodded, a soldier swearing allegiance to a new flag. But not all bent to the wind. Daniels, his pride a festering wound, filed an appeal, his voice dripping with venom as he cried foul, unfair treatment. He claimed, a martyr of a broken system. Richard stood like a granite wall, unyielding, his resolve forged in the crucible of Daniel's own rap sheet. The review unfurled a grotesque tapestry, excessive force, slurs scrawled in reports, complaints buried like bodies under the rug. The appeal crumbled to dust, and Richard's edict rang clear. The days of hiding rot were dead and gone. Daniel slunk away, a fallen king stripped of his crown. But the war wasn't won, not yet. The precinct teetered on a knife's edge, some clinging to the shadows of the past, others stepping haltingly into the light. Each skirmish, every confession, every averted gaze, was a crack in the old order. And Richard knew the tide was turning. However slowly, however fiercely fought, the months unfurled like a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of old ways. Richard Nelson waging a relentless war against the shadows that had long choked Blue Ridge's precinct. Time was a crucible, forging the department in fire and friction. And though the scars of its past still festered, something raw and defiant began to take root. Richard was everywhere, his footsteps a steady drumbeat through the halls, his voice a blade cutting through excuses, his gaze a lighthouse piercing the fog of resistance. The air crackled with change, a storm that refused to break. And beneath it, the precinct trembled on the edge of rebirth or ruin. Not all surrendered to the tide. Conversations on bias and trust sparked like flint on steel. Some officers leaned in, their eyes flickering with reluctant awakening, while others bristled, their defiance a coiled snake ready to strike. Daniels was gone, his appeal a hollow echo crushed under the weight of his sins. But his ghost lingered in the stubborn few who clung to the old guard's tattered banner. Richard met every challenge head-on, a colossus undeterred, replacing the unyielding with recruits who carried his vision like torches in the dark. Each victory was hard-won, a whispered confession, a softened stance, small embers that fueled a growing blaze. One crisp morning, the battlefield shifted beyond the precinct's walls. Richard stood at a community event, the sun glinting off his badge as the crowd milled around him, their skepticism a palpable hum. A boy emerged from the throng, no older than 10, his wide eyes darting between awe and doubt. "You're really the chief?" he asked, his voice a fragile thread in the wind. Richard crouched, his shadow softening as he met the boy's gaze. "I am," he said, a quiet vow in his tone. The child hesitated, then whispered, "My dad says you don't care about us." The words pierced like shrapnel. But Richard held steady, his voice a balm over the wound. "I can't erase what's been. But I swear we're fighting to be better. If you ever need me, you find me, got it?" A timid smile broke across the boy's face. A crack of light in the gloom. And Richard felt it, the flicker of why he'd come here. A spark worth every bruise of this war. By the end of his first year, the precinct stood transformed, not flawless, but fiercely alive. The deadwood was gone, swept away by Richard's unrelenting tide, replaced by voices that echoed his call for justice. The community, once a wall of wary glances, began to thaw, tentative hands reaching across the divide, trust budding like fragile shoots through cracked earth. One evening, Richard lingered in the main hallway, the day's bustle fading into a rare stillness. Officers filed out, their laughter ringing now, not the cruel cackle of exclusion, but a sound woven with camaraderie, a melody of something rebuilt. He watched them go, their silhouettes framed against the dimming light, and for the first time, an ember of hope flared in his chest, bright, unyielding, a beacon against the long night ahead. The road stretched on, treacherous and uncharted, its challenges lurking like wolves in the shadows. But Richard stood tall, his resolve a fortress, knowing every fight, every scar, was a step toward something greater. Change was a brutal dance, a clash of wills and wounds. But as the precinct's heartbeat steadied, he felt it. It was worth it. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the sky was clearing, and in its promise, Blue Ridge began to breathe again. Thank you for accompanying us in today's story. See you again in the next videos. Hello and see you again.